All right, now it's Stephan Salisbury. He's been writing some great stuff with Tom Engelhardt over there at TomDispatch.com and, of course, in Tom's archives at Antiwar.com. And he's got this great piece called Surveillance, America's Pastime, a Hall of Shame of State Snooping, Prying, and Informing, aimed at destroying the fabric of civil society, by Stephan Salisbury. It's also called Keeping an Eye on Everyone. Welcome back to the show. Stephan, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
I really appreciate you joining us today. Who was Ernest C. Withers?
Well, Ernest Withers was a great photographer he was an African-American who grew up in Memphis and chronicled the life of the segregated South during the 1950s and 1960s with his camera. It's very unusual for a professional photographer to be an African-American in those days in that place. And so he's credited with creating some of the great iconic images that came out of the civil rights movement, particularly those that were focused on Memphis, such as images of the sanitation workers' strike in 1968 that brought Martin Luther King to that town and ultimately where he met his death. So Withers was very, very, very well known. He had access to all the major civil rights leaders, including King. He's got wonderful photographs of King relaxing in the Lorraine Motel. Terrific images of the strikers and various actions on the streets of Memphis. But he had another job as well, which was as an informer for the FBI. And so at the time that he was chronicling the growth and spread and activism of the civil rights movement, he was also reporting on the doings of the leadership and also not just the national leadership, but the black political leadership in Memphis. And so he was passing that along to the Memphis office of the FBI, and some of his information led to the takedown of one of the radical groups, African-American groups in Memphis in those days, and 34 people were arrested as a result. He passed pictures of King and Ben Hooks and Andy Young and all these people to the FBI, provided his own insights into what they were thinking, what they were doing, what they were planning at private meetings, because he had total access to these folks. They trusted him completely. And the reason we're talking about it is that the Memphis Commercial Appeal, which is a great little newspaper, did an exhaustive investigation and got all kinds of information through the Freedom of Information Act out of the government that showed Withers, the extent of Withers's informing activities. It was very, very painful disclosure for the civil rights leaders who are still surviving, but it's also a painful disclosure for people who for everyone else. As I report in this piece, Andy Young said, well, he didn't think there was any problem with it. They weren't trying to hide anything and so forth, and that got Dick Gregory, the comedian and activist, all riled up and turned him against Andy, and which is really what the use of informers and in all kinds of surveillance ultimately does. It corrupts personal relationships, family relationships, social relationships, and certainly political relationships. Earl Caldwell, who was a great reporter for the New York Times back in those days, who now teaches journalism at Howard, at Hampton, said that that black journalists had a very special relationship with the black community in the South during those days, and in fact, a group of African American reporters and photographers took out an ad in several black publications back in 1970 saying that we will never betray the trust of the black community. We will never inform. We will never spy. So Earl Caldwell was somewhat devastated by this revelation. As far as he was concerned, if the records released by the commercial appeal proved to be accurate, and there's no reason to doubt that they weren't, then he said that it really put a heavy burden on all journalists. Of course, journalism is absolutely dependent on informing. None of us could do our work if we didn't have informants, which we
Yeah, but informing the press and the public is different than being a rat for J. Edgar Hoover.
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends. Look at the run-up to the war in Iraq, where you had the New York Times reporting all kinds of anonymous information coming out of the government, all pointing the country into war. That to me is the kind of duplicity that the kind of informants that we're talking about with the FBI. That duplicity is the same because
I'm thinking more like the people who were talking to Knight Ridder and saying none of this is true.
Yeah. Well, Knight Ridder got it right. Of course, Knight Ridder is no longer with us, but that's another story. So anyway, for me anyway, the Withers revelations really highlighted the kind of subversions of surveillance and how they disrupt social and political relationships within a society. I mean, whether it's the United States or the Soviet Union, it's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because you can be describing the civil rights era in America or the current COINTELPRO type things being used against the anti-war movement here let's be honest, what we used to accuse the Soviets of all the time is like, this is East Germany where 1 out of 7 works for the Stasi or whatever. Like, they keep trying to do that. In fact, there's a headline on Antiwar.com today here where the NSA's newest recruiters are cartoons, little animals, and according to the Danger Room over there at Wired, part of this is encouraging them to rat on their parents.
Yeah. Well, in this story...
In America. Yeah. You would think, the word America is supposed to mean that something like that is impossible, right? Because we're not East Germany, and yet maybe we are.
Well, we'd like to think that, but yet if you look at the history of the FBI, I mean, it grew out of this kind of subversive surveillance, really. In the wake of World War I, Hoover was put in charge of what was then called the Bureau of Investigation. Now, Hoover was about 25 years old at the time. He'd been a clerk at the Library of Congress. And, what he did was establish a network of informers throughout the country reporting on Russian and immigrant communities, which were then...
You know what, Stephan? We have a problem, which is that the show's over. But I wonder, since we had trouble with the phone and all that, maybe you can come back tomorrow and we can fill up and talk more about COINTELPRO and then bring it up to modern times. That'd be all right?
We can try to do that, sure.
Okay, great. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm very happy that I'm going to get to follow up yesterday's interview with Stephan Salisbury. He had a short time at the end of the show yesterday. And so we're going to be able to talk more about this important subject, which I'll get to in a minute. But first, I will let you know that Stephan Salisbury is a cultural writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he's the author of many books, at least more than one. The latest is Mohamed's Ghosts, an American story of love and fear in the Homeland. And I'll go ahead and mention, because I think it's so important, that if you go back and listen to my previous interviews of Stephan Salisbury, you'll see that they're about bogus terrorism cases. I think there are 2 of them, if I remember right. Welcome back to the show, Stephan. How are you?
I'm good, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing great. I really appreciate you joining us here again today.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, so now we talked a bit about the bad old days of J. Edgar Hoover and COINTELPRO against the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement a bit, and treachery within those movements on behalf of the national government. But, you know, since then, we've had real reforms. We've had attorney generals like Janet Reno and Alberto Gonzales and John Ashcroft, and we've had wonderful FBI directors like Louis Freeh and Robert Mueller. And so all those bad old days are over, and everything's fine now, and civil liberties are protected in America. So I wonder why you would complain about bring up all this old stuff about COINTELPRO from the bad old days of the 1960s.
Well, the bad old days are the good old days, and they're still with us. That's the principal reason. And I mean, virtually every day you can find evidence of it. I mean, as a matter of fact, there were just this past week there were two cases involving two so-called terrorism cases that involved what many consider to be entrapment. One was in Detroit, where an imam was gunned down in an aborted sting that was completely arranged by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with informants that had been sent into a very, very poverty-stricken area and mosque to essentially see if they could coax the imam there, who was a long-time radical black activist, actually, coax the imam to engage in some sort of violent activity. But the imam didn't go along with that. He said he didn't want to get involved in any violence. So they hung around and recorded a lot of conversations surreptitiously in which the imam, who liked to boast about the bad old days, as you referred to him, talked about violence and what he would do if he were ever cornered by the police, and, you know, just general street talk, trash talk, I call it. And they eventually coaxed him into a nothing to do with politics, although the criminal complaint initially sworn out against this imam was full of his boasting and his supposed ambition to establish a separate state in Michigan that would be governed entirely by Sharia law. But they set up a sting that basically was a petty fencing operation, and the imam was sucked into this warehouse, and the police and agents sent a dog after him, and next thing you knew, there was guns shooting everywhere, and he was dead. Now, just last week, the Justice Department Civil Rights Division, at the request of many, 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 many people and members of Congress and civic leaders in Detroit, finally issued a report of its review of the case, in which they exonerated all the law enforcement authorities for any violation of the late imam's civil rights. But this is apparently not. This has not satisfied a lot of people in Detroit, and the report, which I've read, really doesn't answer some basic questions, such as, did the imam even have a gun? Then the other case was a fairly the Detroit case, I should add, did not receive a lot of press attention outside of Detroit.
Well, and isn't that the case, too, where they medevaced the dog, the police dog?
Yeah.
Which I think most people already know that if you somehow hurt a police dog, even if it's attacking your throat or something, then that's assault on a police officer, a Class A felony or whatever. If you kill one, then that's murdering a police officer. Under the law, they could give you life in prison for it. Here they medevaced the dog. Right. And left this man to die on the cold floor. This man who, as you say, could not be entrapped. Yeah. So they just killed him. Yeah, well, that's what a lot of people think, for sure. And there